Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to be showing you how to blend acrylics, but more specifically how to blend fur with acrylics. There are quite a lot of videos here on YouTube on how to blend like backgrounds and large areas, but not anything that shows with the fur. Now if you've got a reference photo like I had for this tutorial here, where the edges of the fur are soft, it's slightly out of focus, those techniques I find require a slightly different approach. You still want your paintbrush strokes to be visible, but they do need their edges to be softer. Now there are a combination of techniques that you can use in order to achieve this, but this video is going to show you how you can do that easily with two very cheap art supplies. And for me, they are my must-have tools for blending acrylics. They do make the process much easier. And these are a fine mist spray bottle and some blending brushes. Now I'm going to go into more detail with these throughout the video, and at the end of this video I'm going to be providing 3 of my top tips for using a fine mist spray bottle to make the process much easier. So my first recommendation would be to get a good base foundation in place. The most common mistake is that we start to try and blend the acrylics too early on. What will happen is, especially depending on the paints that you're using, if the mixture is more transparent, if you try blending too early on, you are just going to have more of that background colour show through. You're not going to be able to achieve the softness in your edges or the opacity in the paint. Now the opacity is where the colour is difficult to see through. So as you can see here, as I'm building up my base foundation, more of that green background is being hidden. You can't see it because it's more opaque and less transparent. That's going to be dependent on the colours that you're using, and again, as I say, the brands of paint. My preference is to use Liquitex Basics. Now they are naturally more transparent, but more of the colours are opaque. So here I'm using a lot more of my unbleached titanium white to achieve that opacity for this first layer. So after you've put in your good base foundation, you can't see that background colour showing through, the next stage is to wait for that to completely dry and then start building up your layers. This is where you can start softening out your edges and then really refining your lights and your darks. Now the most important thing when you're working with any painting, I think, is your contrast, and this should be something that's still focused on when you are painting soft and out of focus fur. Here, I don't want my shadows to be really dark because the fur is naturally softer, therefore it's got that blurry appearance. You're not going to have as many harsh edges like what we have on the face. So that's something to bear in mind. But I still want there to be a really nice variation between my lights and my darks. And then when I am starting to paint in the softer fur, what I'm looking to do is follow the process where I apply the brush strokes. Here I'm using a normal round shaped brush. I am then applying 1 layer of water with my fine mist spray bottle, and then I'm using my blending brushes to soften out my edges. Now it's at this point where the fine mist spray bottle can become difficult to use, so don't forget that at the end of this video I'm going to have 3 of my top tips. One of those is going to be how to avoid mistakes happening when you're using a fine mist spray bottle. So this is just now a rinse and repeat process. Now the one consideration as well that is really important here, if you're happy with what you've currently blended, wait for that to dry and then restart the technique. The reason being, and it happens all the time, especially when you're new to this technique, you will start to blend and you'll get naturally more comfortable with that blending technique. You can then accidentally apply too much moisture with the fine mist sprayer and then the paint. It's then going to end up blending too much with what's already blended. So then you can over blend an area. And that's one of the most common things that can happen when we're blending with acrylics for anything, the background, fur, whatever it might be. Over blending can potentially ruin all of the progress you've made with that blending technique so far. If the tips and techniques that I've shared so far are useful, I would really appreciate it if you could give the video a thumbs up, because it really does help. Now if you would like to see all of this portrait in a real-time tutorial, it's available now on Patreon. You get the reference photo, line art and full material list, so it's a perfect one to follow along to. But this blending technique with the fine mist sprayer bottle is all shown in real time. I'm explaining what I'm doing whilst painting, so I can really show you how you can fix mistakes and really master this technique. So if that is of interest, I will link my Patreon in the description below. So now I've got a really nice soft foundation, but I still need to continue to build up my layers. This is going to depend on how much softness you want to achieve in your painting, but for me, I wanted it to be a little bit more out of focus. So you can see that I'm now just following that same process with applying the paint with my round paintbrush. I then apply some water with my fine mist sprayer bottle, and then I'm using my makeup brush to soften out my edges. Now the brushes themselves are again really important. Blending brushes, specifically for artists, I find shed a lot, which is why I like to use normal makeup brushes here. These I find are so much more robust and they last so much longer. They don't seem to drop their bristles as much as normal art brushes, so this is definitely my preference. The tutorials that I have both here on YouTube and on Patreon, I focus on the layering process thoroughly through each tutorial. I want to make sure that I've built up as much depth as I can, and one common misconception is that soft out of focus fur doesn't require as many layers as detailed fur, like on the face of this puppy. Now although I did add more details to the face, you can see here how many layers I am adding to the body of this dog here. There is not just 1 or 2 layers and then call it done. It is very much a progression. You've got to go through those ugly layers, you've got to push through that process until you start getting something that you're happy with. And even though this clip here is sped up, you can still see when I'm applying that water, because you can see a very fine mist and some of those water droplets over the top of the surface. So that brings me on to the first mistake that you can get when using a fine mist sprayer bottle. Now I mentioned these at the beginning of the video, so I want to focus on how to fix the mistakes first, and then I can give you those 3 tips that I recommend when using a fine mist sprayer bottle. So the mistake that often happens is that we apply too much water to the surface. The fine mist sprayer bottle technique can then become very frustrating. If too much water is applied from the very first instance, your paint will then run, and when you go to blend it, you're just going to be lifting that paint off of the surface rather than blending the edges. So if you're finding that that's happening, it will be because you've got too much water on top. There is a bit of a fine balance. You just want enough of a very fine layer of water over the top. Now the other thing that can cause heavier water droplets, which are not ideal for this type of blending technique, is if you're using a standard spray bottle. These produce much larger water droplets, which are really not ideal for this technique. You will then start to shift the paint and move it across the surface rather than blend it. So a fine mist sprayer bottle, as the name would suggest, definitely is far more suited to this technique. So once you have your fine mist spray bottle, this leads me on to tip 1, and that is to hold that fine mist spray bottle about a foot and a half away from your surface. I find that this is just the right distance away from that canvas that ensures that only a fine layer of water is applied over the top. If that fine mist spray bottle is used too close to the surface, you're going to end up with all of that water that's targeted in much more of a smaller area, and it will just run straight down that painting. So that is my first big tip. My second tip is to only squeeze the trigger halfway. If you put all of that trigger in and you get it as much as you possibly can, I find too much water will come out of that bottle at one time. I would much rather just do a light layer, and if I have to add more water I can do, but adding too much water initially, you're going to have to then wait for that to dry. Now that being said, if you don't have enough water, then obviously the paintbrush strokes are not going to be able to be blended. So there is about finding a balance, but certainly with this technique, the more you use the fine mist sprayer bottle, the easier it gets. Now I do have a few tutorials on Patreon where I'm using this fine mist sprayer bottle, so if you would like to see how this is all shown in those real-time tutorials, then as I say, that's far more in-depth. You can see it more step by step. So tip 3, and again this is a really important one, don't be tempted to use the fine mist sprayer bottle too early on. This does require enough paint to be down to start with. In order to get that soft effect on the edges, it needs to already have some kind of base layer underneath it. Otherwise you're going to always be fighting with those harsher edges or your background throughout those transparent layers. So get a good base foundation in first and then start using that fine mist sprayer bottle. So I hope the tips and techniques that I have shared here are useful. If they were, as I've mentioned, if you could give the video a thumbs up, it makes a real difference. If you would like to keep up to date with the content that I upload, hit the subscribe and the bell button. And if any of my slower in-depth tutorials in pastels or acrylics are of interest, I will link my Patreon in the description below. Now, I also have a Patreon library on my website which lists all of the tutorials there, so you can get an idea of the type of content that I've got before you sign up. Now, the really good thing with Patreon is you can stay for as long as you want, or you can cancel at any time. It's really flexible, and that's one of the reasons why I really do love offering the tutorials there. So if you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below. I'm more than happy to help if I can. I'm going to be uploading another video to YouTube in the next few days. And as always, thank you so much for watching.